once again, welcome to Tapestry Church. If you're joining us for the first time today or the first time in a while, then you might want to know that we are in the middle of a series during this season of Lent called Expensive Love or Cheap Grace. Expensive Love or Cheap Grace, where we're exploring the story of Hosea and what it has to say to us about God. This morning I'll be translating into Spanish since our pastoral intern Jose is not here. He's still on vacation. He'll be back next week. Gracias a Dios. But you'll notice that unlike a couple of weeks ago where I was going back and forth pretty quickly, like every sentence, this time I'm going to experiment with some longer times in each language, okay? So I'm going to do that right now. Una más vez, bienvenidos a Tapestry Church. Si es la primera vez que se une a nosotros hoy, estamos en medio de una serie llamada Amor Caro o Gracia Barata, donde estamos explorando la historia de Oseas y lo que tiene que decir sobre el amor de Dios por nosotros. Esta mañana estaré traduciendo al español, ya que nuestro pasante pastoral, José, todavía está en vacaciones. Si estuviste con nosotros hace un par de semanas, te darás cuenta de que voy a experimentar hablando durante periodos más largos en cada idioma. So if you didn't understand what I just said, that's okay. That's okay. That's actually why we're speaking in both languages. And can I make a suggestion for you the next time I speak in Spanish? All right, if you know a little Spanish or even a medium amount of Spanish, but it's hard still to follow me when I'm speaking in Spanish, it might be tempting to try and sharpen your skills by listening to me in Spanish and trying to hear the words and remember what they mean and all of that. And you can do that if you want to, but I just want you to remember that the purpose of the sermon is to hear God speaking to you through his word, not to learn a new language, as important as that may be. So if you want to use the sermon that way to learn a new language, it is available to you on YouTube after the service. You may go and hear the back and forth translation and learn to your heart's content. But right now, in this moment, I want to invite you to tune me out when I am not speaking in your native tongue. All right? And there's going to be an image on the screen during my sermon. It's of a piece of artwork that was painted into a Bible in about 1270 A.D. An unknown artist. And it's a piece of artwork that is connected to the story of Hosea and Gomer. So while I'm speaking Spanish, I just want to invite you to dwell on that image, to check it out, to deepen your feeling of what's been said in English by seeing the artist's rendition of the story. All right. Si no entendiste lo que acabo de decir en inglés, está bien. Es por eso que estamos hablando ambos idiomas. ¿Puedo hacerle una sugerencia para el momento en que estoy hablando en inglés? Si sabes un poco de inglés, pero es difícil seguirme en inglés, podría ser tentador tratar de mejorar tus habilidades escuchando en inglés. Puedes hacer eso si quieres. Pero recuerda que el propósito del sermón es escuchar a Dios hablándote a través de su palabra, no aprender un nuevo idioma. Si desea usar el sermón de esa manera, está disponible en YouTube para que la vuelva a ver. Pero ahora mismo, en este momento, te invito a desconectarme cuando no esté hablando tu lengua materna. Hay una imagen, una obra de arte de una Biblia pública en el siglo XIII que estará en la pantalla durante mi sermón. Quiero invitarlos a que te dejan en esa imagen mientras les hablo en el idioma menos familiar para ustedes. Okay, let's read the Bible together from Hosea 3, 1 through 5. Hosea 3, 1 through 5. I'm going to read in English, and then the text will be available in Spanish as well. Leamos juntos a la Biblia desde Oseas 3, 1 a 5. Voy a leer en inglés y el texto también estará disponible en español. The Lord said to me, "Go, show your love to your wife again, though she is loved by another man and is an adulteress. Love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods and love the sacred raisin cakes." So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and about a homer and a lethek of barley. Then I told her, "You are to live with me many days. You must not be a prostitute or be intimate with any man, and I will behave the same way toward you. For the Israelites will live many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred stones, without ephod or household gods. Afterward, the Israelites will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They will come trembling to the Lord and to his blessings in the last days." Amen. Esta es la palabra de Dios. Thanks be to God. If your heart has ever been broken, you know what it was like for Hosea. If the person you loved walked out on you, got together with someone else, you know what it was like for Hosea. And sadly, that's a story that's as old as time. It's relatable in every culture, in every church, and man, almost in every family around the world. The betrayal, the heartbreak, and the consequences are familiar to us. And yet there's a major difference between most of us and Hosea when something like that happens. When someone walks out on us, we have a choice to make. Will we take them back? Will we move on without them and build a new life? Hosea didn't have a choice. Si tu corazón alguna vez ha sido quebrantado, sabes cómo fue para Oseas. Si la persona que ambas te abandonó se juntó con alguien más, sabes cómo fue para Oseas. Lamentablemente, I can't say that word. Lamentablemente, that's it. Es una historia que es tan antigua como el tiempo, identificable en todas las culturas, en todas las iglesias y en casi todas las familias extendidas del mundo. La traición, el desamor y las consecuencias no son familiares. Y sin embargo, hay una gran diferencia entre la mayoría de nosotros y Oseas. Cuando alguien nos abandona, tenemos que tomar una decisión. ¿Los recuperaremos? ¿Seguiremos adelante sin ellos y construiremos una nueva vida? Oseas no tuvo elección. As we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, Hosea was a prophet in ancient Israel. He was tasked with displaying God's heart for Israel. But Hosea was tasked with this not only with his words, but also with his life. And specifically with his family life. His marriage to Gomer, someone with a checkered past, was meant to be an image of God's commitment to Israel. The name of Hosea's own children, as we talked about a couple weeks ago, was a sign of judgment, but also of the restoration that God would bring to his people. But here in chapter 3, what Hosea must have feared would happen from the beginning of this arrangement actually happened. Gomer has left him for another man. And as it turns out, God is not done showing his love to Israel through Hosea's family, even in this instance. Como hemos estado hablando en las últimas semanas, Oseas fue un profeta en el antiguo Israel. Tenía la tarea de mostrar el corazón de Dios por Israel, no solo con sus palabras, sino también con su propia vida familiar. Su matrimonio con Gomer, alguien con un pasado accidentado, pretendía ser una imagen del compromiso de Dios con Israel. El nombre de los hijos de Oseas era una señal de juicio, pero también de la restauración que Dios traería sobre su pueblo. Pero aquí en el capítulo 3, lo que Oseas debe hacer temido desde el comienzo de su relación con Gomer, en realidad ha sucedido. Ella lo ha dejado por otro hombre. Y resulta que Dios no ha terminado de mostrar su amor a Israel a través de la familia de Oseas. God says to Hosea, go, show your love to your wife again, though she is loved by another man and is an adulteress. Love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods and love the sacred raisin cakes. Now, I got to be honest with you. I don't honestly know what raisin cakes have to do with anything. The truth is that scholars don't really know. They can only speculate that maybe they had to do with worshiping some other gods. That's the truth. The other truth is that fruit cakes of any kind have no business being called cakes, but that is a different sermon altogether. Whatever the deal is with the sacred raisin cakes, the Lord is saying that when Israel puts other gods before him, when they trust other powers for protection and fulfillment before their God, it's the same thing as Gomer walking out on Hosea. It's adultery. It's heartbreak. Dios dice, ve, muestra tu amor a tu esposa otra vez, aunque ella es amada por otro hombre y es adúltera. Ámala como la Señor ama los israelitas, aunque ellos se vuelvan hacia otros dioses y aman las sagradas tortas de pasas. Let's see if this joke comes off in Spanish. I don't know if it will. Ahora, sinceramente, no sé qué tienen que ver los pasteles de pasas con nada. La verdad es que los eruditos solo pueden especular que tenían algo que ver con adorar a otros dioses. La otra verdad es que los pasteles de frutas de cualquier tipo no tienen por qué llamarse pasteles. Pero ese es un sermón diferente. Cualquiera que sea el trato con las tortas de pasas, el Señor está diciendo que cuando Israel pone a otros dioses antes que Él, cuando confía en otros poderes para protección y cumplimiento ante su Dios, es lo mismo que Gomer andando sobre Oseas. Es adulterio, es angustia. But God says to Hosea, if Gomer is treating you like Israel treats me, then you have an opportunity to love her like I love them. So he commands Hosea to, quote, love her like the Lord loves the Israelites. That means that by looking at Hosea's love for Gomer in this passage, we get a picture of God's love for his wayward people. And in that picture, we see two things. We see two things about God's love for his people. First is that God's love is costly. And second, God's love is curative. The First is that God's love is costly, and the second is that God's love is curative. See if you can see that in the image behind me. Pero Dios le dice a Oseas, si Homer te trata como Israel me trata a mí, entonces tienes la oportunidad de amar a tu esposa como yo amo a Israel. Así que le ordena a Oseas que la ame como el Señor ama a los israelitas. Eso significa que al observar aquí el amor de Oseas por Homer, obtenemos una imagen del amor de Dios por su pueblo descarriado. Y en esa imagen vemos dos cosas sobre el amor de Dios. Uno, el amor de Dios es costoso. Y dos, el amor de Dios es curativo. Uno, el amor de Dios es costoso, y dos, el amor de Dios es curativo. First, God's love is costly. God's love is costly. I want to get into this from something that's been in the news lately. Have you ever heard of ransomware? Right? Ransomware is basically hackers designing a virus of some sort to get into your computer or into your system, or into your servers, to lock up all of your data. And if it's, you personally, it might be your financial records or pictures of your family, or your business plan, or your book that you've been writing for years. They lock it up, and then they tell you that if you want it back, you got to pay to get it. According to Palo Alto Networks, the average ransomware payment in the first half of 2021 was $570,000. And the largest single payment was $11 million. When you get hit with a ransomware demand, it is expensive. It is difficult, but it's not just the money. It's what the expense means. It's what the attack, what the ransom means. It's vulnerable feeling. And frankly, it's an insult. You have to pay to get back your own stuff. Like someone came into your house, robbed you, took your stuff to a pawn shop, and you had to go buy it back for twice its price. It's adding insult to injury. Primero, el amor de Dios es costoso. ¿Has oído hablar del ransomware? Estuvo en las noticias mucho el año pasado. Básicamente, los piratas informáticos diseñan un virus para ingresar a su computadora, bloquear todos sus datos, tus registros financieros, fotografías de sus hijos, ese libro o plan de negocios en el que ha estado trabajando durante años, lo encierran y luego te dicen que tienes que pagarles un rescate para recuperarlo. Según las redes de Palo Alto, el pago promedio de ransomware en la primera mitad de 2021, I should know how to say that, fue de más que $500,000 $500,000. Y el pago individual más grande fue de $11 millones. Cuando recibe una demanda de ransomware, no es solo el gasto lo que es difícil, es lo que significa el gasto. Es la vulnerabilidad que sientes. Y francamente, es un insulto. Estás pagando para conseguir tus propias cosas. Como si alguien viniera a tu casa, te robará, ya llevará a la casa de empeño y ahora estés pagando el doble para recuperar tus propias cosas. Now, we don't know why. We don't know why Hosea had to pay to get Gomer back. She must have somehow indebted herself to her current lover, maybe even just by living off of his provision he felt he was entitled to some recompense. And we don't know exactly how much the shekels and the barley that Hosea paid were worth. But what we do know is that Hosea had to pay a significant sum to a stranger to get his own wife back. His own wife. And this with no guarantee that she wasn't going to just run off again. He must have felt vulnerable. He must have felt insulted. Loving Gomer was not just expensive financially, but it was expensive socially and emotionally as well. No sabemos por qué Oseas tuvo que pagar para recuperar a Gomer. Ella debe haberse endeudado de alguna manera con su amante actual, tal vez solo viviendo de su provisión. Y no sabemos exactamente cuánto valían los ciclos y la cebada, pero lo que sí sabemos es que Oseas tuvo que pagar una suma significativa a un extraño para recuperar a su propia esposa. Sin ninguna garantía, si no saldría corriendo y volvería a hacer esto. Debe haberse sentido vulnerable, debe haberse sentido insultado. Amar a Gomer no solo fue costoso económicamente, sino también social y emocionalmente. We see in Hosea's tangible payment for Gomer an intangible reality that we've all experienced ourselves. And that is that forgiveness doesn't come cheap. Forgiveness doesn't come cheap. It's costly. I mean, think of when you have had to forgive something. You had to forgive somebody for something that really was painful for you. You have to swallow your pride. You have to let go of your claims to justice completely. In fact, you actually have to pay some of those claims to justice for restoration yourself by taking on the pain of the situation and not giving it back. That's what forgiveness is like. And God is saying that is exactly what it's like for me loving you. It's expensive. It's costly. Sometimes we imagine, I think, that it's easy for God to forgive us. Because God is love, right? So he must just overlook our flaws and our failings and our turnings away. We mess up and he gives us a nod and a wink and forgives and forgets. Simple as that, right? Easy. Maybe not so easy. Vemos en el pago tangible de Oseas por Gomer una realidad intangible que todos hemos experimentado por nosotros mismos. El perdón no es barato, es costoso. Tienes que tragarte tu orgullo. Tienes que dejar de lado tus reclamos de justicia. De hecho, tienes que pagar por la justicia, por la restauración, tú mismo, incluso si la otra persona debería pagar el precio. Así es el perdón. Y Dios está diciendo que así es exactamente para mí. Amándote es caro, es costoso. A veces imaginamos que es fácil para Dios. Debido a que Dios es amor, pensamos, Él simplemente pasa por alto nuestros defectos y fallas. Nos equivocamos. Él nos da un asentimiento y un guiño. Perdona y olvida. Sencillo. Fácil. And friends, God is love. Yes, He is. But we forget what the Apostle Paul says in Corinthians. Love suffers long. And we forget sometimes how great a price God paid to get us back. We forget that justice for running away from God is life without God. That's what justice for running away from God is just getting what you asked for. Is life without God, life separated from the source of all life. Death. And we forget that God, being a just God, cannot just forget about justice. I'm going to say that again. We forget that God, being a just God, cannot forget about justice. That's part of his love. So he paid the price himself. The Son of God himself, Jesus of Nazareth, paid the cost at the cost of his own life. And God, the Son of God, was separated from the Father. God's love for his people, God's love for us, cost him dearly, friends. Dios es amor, sí, pero amigos, olvidamos que el amor sufre mucho. Y olvidamos el gran precio que nuestro Dios ha pagado para recuperarnos. Olvidamos que la justicia por huir de Dios es vida sin Dios, vida separada de la fuente de toda vida, que es otra forma de decir muerte. Y olvidamos que Dios, siendo un Dios justo, no puede simplemente olvidarse de la justicia. Así que Él mismo pagó el precio a costa de su propio Hijo. El Hijo de Dios, Jesús de Nazaret, pagó nuestro rescate a costa de su propia vida. El amor de Dios por su pueblo, el amor de Dios, de Dios por nosotros es costoso, amigos. Now you would think that because it costs so much to get us back, or I should say that it costs so much for Hosea to get Gomer back, you would think that Hosea would make some kind of demands on Gomer before he pays the price. Some kind of contract of fidelity before he buys her back. You'd think that he'd make her show him somehow that she's changed, to demonstrate it. Demonstrate that she can be trusted. That's what most of us would do. And we wouldn't, by the way, be wrong for doing it in a relational context. Let me just say that out front. God is not calling everybody to be Hosea. But do you see what happens in our story when Hosea's love mirrors God's love? Hosea says, so I bought her back, and then I said, then I said, be faithful to me, and I'll be faithful to you. You see, this is the second point, that God's love is not only costly, but it's curative, and it's restorative. But the cure comes after the cost, not before. The cure comes after the payment has already been made, not before. God treats his people the same way that Hosea treats Gomer. He buys them back. He shows them his love at great cost to himself, and only after that does he teach them how to love him in return. That is the model that he uses throughout the entire story of his history with his people. Ahora pensarías, porque le cuesta tanto, que Oseas le exigiría que primero le hiciera algunas promesas de fidelidad. Uno pensaría que él haría que ella le mostrará que había cambiado, que se puede confiar en ella. Pero, ¿ves lo que sucede en la historia? Oseas dice, así que la volví a comprar y luego dije, sé fiel a mí y te seré fiel. Y este es el segundo punto. El amor de Dios no solo es costoso, es curativo, es restaurador. Pero la cura viene después del costo y no antes. Dios trata a su pueblo de la misma manera. Él los vuelve a comprar, les muestra su amor a un gran costoso para sí mismo, y solo después de eso les enseña cómo amarlo a cambio. Sometimes I think that we think that we have to be cured before we come to God. That the order is the other direction. That the cure comes before the cost. We get ourselves together, and then God will pay the price for somebody that's worth it. So we think that we have to get our stuff together before we even come to church. We think we need to have dealt with our addiction before we come to God. We think we need to have healed our marriage before we come to church. We think that we need to have gotten over our anger at God before we step into worship. We think we need to have done some type of penance before we step into God's presence. But friends, we cannot be cured without the great physician. I believe that at the core of all of these and many other challenges in life is, if we dig deep enough, is a deep, deep feeling that we are not loved. Not really. Not when it comes down to it. Not the way we are. But God says, I love you now. I love you first. I bought you when you were a fixer-upper. My love is the cure. A veces pensamos que tenemos que ser curados antes de venir a Dios. Creemos que tenemos que tener nuestras cosas juntas antes de venir a la iglesia. Pensamos que necesitamos haber lidiado con nuestra adicción antes de venir a Dios. Pensamos que necesitamos haber sanado nuestro matrimonio antes de venir a la iglesia. Pensamos que necesitamos haber superado nuestra ira contra Dios antes de venir a adorar. Creemos que debemos haber hecho algún tipo de penitencia antes de entrar en la presencia de Dios. Pero amigos, no podemos curarnos sin el gran médico. Creo que en el centro de todos nuestros desafíos en la vida, si profundizamos lo suficiente, hay un sentimiento profundo de que no somos amados. Realmente no. No de la forma en que somos. Pero Dios dice, te amo ahora, ahorita. Te amo primero. Mi amor es la cura. Now, to be honest, the cure of God's love can feel costly to us. I mean, look at verse 4. The Israelites will live many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred stones, without ephod or household gods. Afterward, the Israelites will return and seek the Lord their God. It's a process. It's a process, and a deeply painful process in this case for Israel. The passage is likely a prophecy about the coming exile, where Israel won't have their own king or their own royal house, their own self-government. Which, frankly, if you read through the history of Israel, the kings led the people away from God more than toward him. They won't have a temple in which to sacrifice or perform their sacred religious rites, which, frankly, had over time become ways of pretending they were committed to God while neglecting the deeper things of the law. But they also won't have their household gods. In their exile, they will be forced to rely only on the Lord. All of those other things stripped away. Ahora, la cura puede parecer costosa para nosotros. Mire el versículo 4. Los israelitas vivirán muchos días sin rey ni príncipe, sin sacrificio ni piedras sagradas, sin efod ni dioses domésticos. Después los israelitas volverán y buscarán al Señor su Dios. Este pasaje es probablemente una profecía sobre el exilio venidero, donde Israel no tendrá su propio rey o casa real, que francamente los había alejado de Dios con tanta frecuencia en su historia. No tendrán un templo para sacrificar o realizar sus ritos religiosos que se han convertido en formas de fingir que están comprometidos con Dios, pero tampoco tendrán dioses domésticos, sino que en su exilio se verán obligados a confiar solo en el Señor. Do you see what Hosea is saying here? He's saying that the exile, that part of the history of Israel that we read often as a judgment, as a punishment from God, and in other prophets it is noted that way. Hosea's perspective is that this exile was actually the plan of a loving God who has already before it demonstrated His commitment to His people to strip away rival lovers from their lives, to teach them how to love Him again. You see, the curative love of God can feel costly for us. He'll strip away rival lovers. He'll ask you to leave behind those things that make it difficult for you to fully love Him. He'll ask you to leave behind that addiction. He'll ask you to leave behind your sexual autonomy. He'll ask you to leave behind your love of money, like Jesus did the rich young ruler. He may ask you to leave behind your ambitions to get ahead, your idolization of marriage or of your children, or the public image that you've built for yourself. God's love is costly for Him, yes, but the healing can also feel very costly for us in the meantime. ¿Ves lo que Oseas está diciendo aquí? Él está diciendo que el exilio fue en realidad el plan de Dios amoroso que ya demostró su compromiso con su pueblo, para despojar a los amantes rivales de sus vidas y enseñarles a amarlo nuevamente. ¿Ves que el amor curativo de Dios puede resultar costoso para nosotros? Despojará a los amantes rivales. Te pedirá que dejes atrás aquellas cosas que te dificultan amarlo por completo. Te pedirá que dejes atrás tu adicción. Te pedirá que dejes atrás tu autonomía sexual. Él te pedirá que dejes atrás tu amor por el dinero, como lo hizo Jesús con el joven rico. Puedo que te pida que dejes atrás tus ambiciones de salir adelante, tus idolatría del matrimonio o de tus hijos o la imagen pública que te has construido. El amor de Dios es costoso para Él, pero la sanción también puede resultar costoso para nosotros. It may feel costly, the cure, but friends, it is also so deeply worth it. There's one last thing I want you to see in this passage. And initially, it's something that puzzled me. It may have puzzled you when we read it. It's this last sentence. They will come trembling to the Lord and to His blessings. I understand. I've been in this game a long time, and I understand the concept of the fear of the Lord. And I don't have time to break it down now, but I get it. But the thing that was bothering me was, why would you come trembling to His blessings? But that word fear in Hebrew, or as it's translated trembling here, it also carries with it this sense, this meaning of awe, being awestruck, like you are when you go see the Grand Canyon. Like being awestruck from something so grand. And the word blessing is actually a translation of the Hebrew word that's elsewhere translated as goodness. So another accurate and to me, in this context, more meaningful translation of this sentence is, they will come awestruck by the Lord and his goodness in the last days. They will come awestruck by the Lord and his goodness in the last days. In other words, having been forgiven by God at such a great cost, having submitted ourselves to the costly cure of his love, our own souls will be set right again. And when we look at God, we won't see someone that we would ever want to run out on ever again. But someone so incredibly, so unbelievably, so undeniably good that we are overwhelmed with love for him. Puede parecer costoso, pero vale mucho la pena. Hay una última cosa que quiere que veas en este pasaje. La última oración me desconcertó inicialmente. Vendrán temblando al Señor a sus bendiciones. Entiendo el temor del Señor, pero ¿por qué vendrías temblando a las bendiciones de Dios? Pero esa palabra para temor o temblor aquí en hebreo también lleva el significado de temor, y la palabra bendiciones es solo otra traducción de la palabra para bondad. Entonces, otra traducción precisa y para mí más significativa es: ellos vendrán asombrados por el Señor y su bondad en los últimos días. En otras palabras, habiendo sido perdonados por Dios a gran precio, habiéndose sometido nosotros mismos a la costosa curación de su amor, nuestra propia alma se enderezará de nuevo. Cuando miramos a Dios, no veremos a alguien de quien jamás querríamos huir, sino a alguien tan innegablemente bueno, que simplemente ya estamos abrumados de amor por Él.